I'm Richard Hefner, your host on The Open Mind, and I begin to fear that perhaps I haven't taken serious enough the venerable injunction I so often quote here: have an open mind, but not so open that your brains fall out. For on today's subject, and faced with a guest whose brilliance and erudition I so much respect, but whose position on our subject I can't easily embrace, I find myself not just open-minded, but I fear quite incapable of making up my mind. William F. Buckley, Jr. has been called the guru, the patron saint of American conservatives, which has made it particularly hard for some of us to identify him with the call for decriminalization or legalization of drugs. Supposedly, that's a radical cause, better left than right. Yet Buckley is astonishingly enough joined with Milton Friedman, George Shultz, and other leaders of his conservative establishment in calling for drug legalization. Indeed, Mr. Buckley has devoted column after column in his National Review to this crusade, particularly the now famous February 12, 1996 issue titled "The War on Drugs is Lost." Now, in May, Mr. Glenn H. Early wrote me from Oxford, Wisconsin, about this National Review offering. He wrote, "I pray you will find this topic interesting and possibly express your opinions." But the fact is that I haven't made up my own mind on this topic and would instead ask my guest once again to précis for us his case for drug legalization, his response to A.M. Rosenthal's insistence that those who would legalize drugs play the cruelest hoax, and perhaps his response to my own gut feeling that the very last thing Americans need at the dawn of the 21st century is what may so easily be taken as a further sanction for mindlessness and escape from reality. Mr. Buckley, convince me, please.
Well, you began by saying you wouldn't easily embrace my position. I don't mind if you embrace my position after some effort.
Okay.
So you want the effort.
Right.
First of all, please don't mistake my position for that of people who are indifferent to drugs. I'm not indifferent to drugs. I think I've been quoted as saying if I could turn a single latch, which would make all of the drugs disappear from the face of the earth, with the exception of here and there a vineyard in Bordeaux, I would turn that latch. Now, you say it's inconsistent for a conservative to take my position. I don't think it is, because a conservative seeks to be grounded in reality. That which works is codifiable. That which simply does not work isn't. If we were to pass a law requiring people to go to church on Sunday, it wouldn't work. Under the circumstances, you would eventually simply withdraw such a law. My position on drugs is that the drug laws aren't working, and that more damage net is being done by their continuation on the books than would be done by withdrawing them from the books. This, as I say, should not be confused as a sanction for drugs. Drugs are a form of escapism, and the damage in taking them is not by any means self-limited. It damages other people also. For that reason, the question is, how do you diminish the net harm done by drugs? How are you coming on my campaign?
I'm following you. I'm following you.
Well, suppose one were to ask the following question. How do you measure the net damage done by the existing situation? Well, you begin by people who take drugs, they're damaged. Then you add to that the number of people who are engaged in trying to prevent them from doing that. That's 400,000 policemen. Then you add whatever dollar measurement you wish to attach to derivative losses in liberty and security. Mr. and Mrs. Jones, who can't safely cross the park at night because they would likely run into a drug marauder, have lost something tangible. Mr. and Mrs. Jones who need to lock up at night have lost something tangible. To the extent that you can talk about cities being imperiled, they are imperiled by what? By people who need to either to sustain their own habit or who wish to profiteer from the weaknesses of others who have that habit, which means that they are robbing or stealing approximately 100 times the pharmaceutical cost of that drug. Now, I've seen varying estimates of what that cost figure is. I've never seen one that's less than $500 billion. And we're spending $125 to $30 billion in our war on drugs. I would infinitely prefer to reduce that net loss to the cost of looking after people who have the habit and who need care, which would take us down to $20–30 billion a year, and have the relative liberty that would flow from a situation in which half of America isn't constipated by worrying about drug takers and by drug sellers and by people who rob and steal in order to profiteer from the situation.
Well, now, in a recent issue of National Review, you summed up some of the responses from your readers, those who read the February issue. One of the questions that occurred, and it seemed to me it is a basic question, was to put to you whether this isn't, in a very real sense, a moral question, the answer to which cannot then be given in terms of billions or hundreds of millions or trillions of dollars, and that you yourself would be the first person to indicate that.
No, because the moral stigma continues, in my judgment, to attach to it. Anybody who becomes an alcoholic, which is probably the primary curse of this country, in my judgment, is morally stigmatized by permitting himself to get into that condition. That is not an argument for prohibition. Adultery is widely practiced, so is fornication. You can simultaneously say it's morally wrong, but we're not going to tell the police to open the doors of every motel to find out whether the people inside have marriage licenses.
But in this instance, we have to say to our youngsters, this was against public policy. Up until 1996, you would have it that way. 1997, it is not. It's a strange message.
Well, it's a message that we undertook to say in 1933.
With the end of Prohibition.
That's right. And it's a message that, in my judgment, we're perfectly capable of taking when things didn't work out. We pulled out of Vietnam, and we pulled away from Prohibition. We pulled away from a number of compulsory blue laws, all of them in the last few years, by the way. This doesn't mean that you encourage a defiance of the commandment that you shall keep holy the Sabbath. It simply means that it doesn't become church business, state business.
It seems so. It still seems so strange to me that.
I'm not saying it doesn't seem strange to you.
You're saying,
but I don't mind.
else?
I don't mind adopting a policy that seems strange to you, if the result of it is going to make a society improved over how that society currently operates.
Now, may I ask you a question?
Sure.
What's the downside, as Buckley sees it?
Well, the downside is that almost inevitably you will find X number of people, I don't know how many they are, and there are disputes about this, X number of people who say, now that I can actually walk into a federal drugstore and buy it, I'll go ahead and do so. Now, this is widely reflected on. How many people in that category are there? The ACLU, at least Ira Glasser, who's the head of it, he doesn't think that there would necessarily be any increase in drug taking. His point is that the fact that it's illegal adds a certain allure to it that will all of a sudden dissipate if it weren't illegal. A second school of thought says, okay, they will try it, but having tried it, having had their experience, they will withdraw from it. 98, I want to get the figures right, 98 billion people in the United States have experimented with illegal drugs.
Million.
Million, sorry. 3.5 million are current addicts, as defined by did you take one in the last 30 days. Now, if you say, well, 95 million can pull out of it, having done it at school or in college or whenever, there's no reason why you can't project that experience in the future by the number of people who, okay, it's legal, I'll try it, and then do it once. But now it's very dangerous to do. I would certainly caution against it. But all that money that's currently spent on constraint could be spent on education. And by the way, there's no reason not to encourage social sanctions against it, i.e., if you come to work for Mr. Hefner, you can't take drugs. And if you don't consent to have an occasional drug test extemporaneously scheduled, then don't apply for a job. I'm all in favor of social sanctions for it. It's the legal sanction that I think is killing us.
Now, as a prime debater, would you say that that was a very good summary of the downside? Seriously.
Well, I don't think what other downside there is.
Well, let's ask the question about the saying to our young people, yes, this is tough. We haven't been able to make it as yet, and it's so tough and it's so costly. Let's abandon the effort. For some reason, I see that as a quite incredible downside, because you're not embracing drugs, as you said. You wanted to make that perfectly clear. You're saying it's too damn tough to achieve.
Well, I would offhand guess that the majority of young people would be encouraged by a finding of that character, because it would tell them that adults are living in the real world. Let me remind you, Mr. Hefner, that the opposition, the illegality of drugs, does not actually affect the quantity of their consumption. As one person put it to me only last fall, it's easier to buy marijuana in Cambridge than it is beer. Why? Because if somebody sells you illegal beer, he forfeits his license. And his license might have cost $200,000, his whole plant. Whereas people who peddle marijuana can do so furtively with no overhead. I don't think anybody would maintain that if you want drugs, you can't find them. The very fact that they're imported and consumed in such quantities simply defies that assertion.
If you become the drug czar somewhere along the past 10, 20 years, do you think you could have been more effective or in solving our problem?
It depends on my authority. Obviously, if I was
Total
a drug
authority.
czar. Total authority, plenipotentiary?
Yes, you are the drug
okay.
czar.
If I were the drug czar, I would say, okay, here are the 5 or 6 popular illegal drugs. You can get them at a federal drugstore for just more than the pharmaceutical cost of producing them, enough to sustain the overhead, but enough also to discourage a black market in them. But before you go in there, you're going to have to read a description of what this drug does to you. And if you're in a mood to play Russian roulette, go ahead and take some crack cocaine, because the probability that you will be seriously affected by this is up around 8–10%. So therefore, I would give them all the warning that they needed about the toxicity that they were willing to accept in indulging this habit. But I would not let the price rise to where Mr. Middleman decides that he's going to sell you that crack cocaine, and in order to get it, he's going to thunder around in people's living rooms or steal women's purses or mug people.
Now, you were in the Army. You remember those horrendous films. What you're going to do if you pick up syphilis when you go into town, And you know that the AIDS horror pictures, the horror information, has been about as effective as those old Army films, not terribly, terribly much more. Do you really feel that accompanying warning would be effective?
Well, first of all, let me distinguish between the two, because AIDS and syphilis are the result of passions that become ungovernable. Lust or love causes people to do things that they wouldn't do in premeditation. Deliver us from temptation, says the Lord's Prayer, i.e. deliver you from that third drink if you have alcoholic tendencies and are going to go on to the 10th drink. By the same token, people who give in to unsafe sex practices are, quote, carried away. But this would not apply to a relatively clinical decision to buy crack cocaine, because people wouldn't buy it when they were stoned. That's not the way drugs work. You have your trip and you're over it, then you reflect and decide whether or not to go again. So there is that distinction. A second distinction is that there is no way ever to protect people categorically from the results of their own unruly appetites. This is obviously true in sex. It's obviously true in alcohol, and it should be obviously true in respect of drugs. This doesn't mean that equivalent laws to what we now have in drugs should apply to alcohol or to sex.
You know, just 6 months before your now famous, notorious, however you want to identify it, National Review issue in February '96, August '95, you wrote this piece, National Review, Jerry Garcia, rest in peace. As I read this now, I wonder how could the man who wrote this have gone on 6 months later and recommended reluctantly, perhaps, legalization.
Can you remind me of the contradictions?
Yes, because you're saying that Garcia you indicate that he led a young person who had worked in your office, participated in leading him down the garden path. And your implication here is, it seems to me that there were, that something unusual accounted for the young Americans, pictures of them reproduced in the days just gone by, exhibiting Dionysic pleasures in their role as deadheads. Exuberance finds its forms throughout the world and concentrates its energies on the young. But is the joy unconfined, ought it to be? And you see him when you write that he had predicted only a week after leaving the Betty Ford Center, he had said 2 years ago that he really needed to do something to restore his health, otherwise he would be dead like 2 years from now. He went on schedule, you wrote, and is said to have died with a smile on his face, no doubt because he was a happy man, but also because he made so many others happy. But he also killed, if that's the right word for such as our intern, a lot of people. And although he had a pulsating forum worldwide for 30 years and knew from his own experience what his habits were doing to him, he never went public on it, not really. I know that my raising this point of what you wrote in August '95 doesn't diminish one bit the suffering that you indicate our nation had experienced, which led you to your quest for legalization. But it's not as simple as government, drug shops. Is it really? I mean, do you see it in this?
Well, I didn't say that was simple. I said that's a way of defeating the black market. The cost of drugs between 1% and 2%, the pharmaceutical cost of drugs, of what you have to pay the man on the street corner. But where Garcia figures in this is that he encouraged a kind of detachment from reality that led a lot of people, like my young friend, to simply suspend his natural, or even his cultivated sense of morality and self-restraint, in the same sense that a great courtesan might encourage people to lose restraints. Jerry Garcia encouraged people to lose restraints. The guy who just died, who was famous for saying, turn loose and, what was the rest of that phrase? Tune out. Garcia gave that message, and I was reproving him for doing that. I think it's impossible to detach that from the memory of Garcia.
And you think we can separate that message out from now saying to youngsters, we have legalized? I'm not talking about the beginnings of national policy.
Well, I would certainly discourage anybody from trying to advertise the beauties of drugs. It would be nobody saying patronize this federal drugstore and see what thrill you get out of cocaine. As things now stand, we're not permitted to advertise cigarettes on television, so we certainly wouldn't have any First Amendment problems in cranking up a program against advertising drugs.
No, but we haven't as yet said you may not advertise tobacco and nicotine. We talked about a special area, broadcasting. We haven't done that yet.
Well, that's because of the tobacco lobbies. But if we chose not to do that, question would it survive a First Amendment test?
Mm-hmm.
I think it probably would. I certainly have no doubt that a prohibition against advertising cocaine would survive a First Amendment. If not, would change the First Amendment.
All right, let me ask you this question. What do you think is going to happen?
I think we need... See, I'm sorry, I have some trouble here.
Enough water?
We need to await the day when a politician with national prestige says, look, this hasn't worked. Now, I don't predict that day is around the corner, but I think there's an increasing natural sense that it hasn't worked. We got an awful lot of mail after that issue went out. 450 letters is a lot of mail for Journal of Opinion. And only 4 or 5% said you shouldn't have even brought the subject up, although a half were opposed to the conclusions we arrived at. 100% were glad that we've ventilated the controversy. So I think there's a lot of latent feeling out there, and I would like to see the politician who just risks a forward position on it. Mayor Schmoke of Baltimore is the closest, and he was reelected quite thunderously, notwithstanding that he said it just before his last election. So I think that there will be a distillation of sentiments that are already empirically widely felt.
Now, if you were in my position, what would you say to Buckley about the potential for damage in his position? No, you wouldn't. You wouldn't, not if you were in my position. What I asked you about downside before, and now, in a sense, a similar question. What damage do you see that National Review is doing to the war against drugs, which you diminish?
Well, we can hardly damage the war against drugs because the war against drugs is futile. There's no way in which our piece encourages anybody to seek out illegal drugs. The big question before the House in an ideal situation is, to what extent are you willing to employ social sanctions? Now, Nicholas Van Hoffman listed 15 things that he's in favor of legalization, 15 things that he would do to anybody who was caught taking drugs or couldn't prove he hadn't taken drugs. They are really quite draconian. Fire them, take away their driver's license, everything except tattoo them. I think he goes a little bit too far, but he opens up a very interesting window, i.e., what kind of social sanctions have not been harnessed that might be harnessed to discourage experimentation with drugs.
We're going to do a second program. Let's talk about them, because my signal is we're out of time. Thank you, William Buckley, for joining me today. And thanks, too, to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time. And if you would like a transcript of today's program, please send $4 in check or money order to The Open Mind, P.O. Box 7977, FDR Station, New York, New York 10150. Comments can be sent to this address or via email to openmindtv@aol.com. Meanwhile, as an old friend used to say, good night and good luck. Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the M. Weiner Foundation of New Jersey, the Thomas and Teresa Malarkey Foundation, the New York Times Company Foundation, and from the corporate